This place behind me, tucked underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, why is it even still here? And I have literally gone over that bridge thousands of times in my life, and Fort Point has been here the whole time. But there is so much I did not know. This place is fascinating, and the fact that it sits underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, why didn't they just tear this place down?
And if you want to understand San Francisco's history just a little bit, this is a great place to start. I think when we look at Fort Point, it looks small and almost insignificant. But to really begin to understand why this place mattered so much, we got to get back in the Wayback Machine and go to 1849 San Francisco. The gold rush in San Francisco was in full effect. And overnight, San Francisco went from a pretty minor outpost to an important strategic location, to a state and a place where incredible amounts of wealth were being pulled out of the Sierra Nevada mountains.
And the crazy thing about this is other countries noticed how much wealth was coming out of California because of the gold rush. So the Spaniards and the British and the Russians, they all knew what was going on, and they realized that California was pretty much undefended. If you think about the east coast of the United States at that time and all the people, then this vast expanse in the middle of the country, there was nothing. And then there was California out here all by its lonesome.
If you look at the map, you can see that the mouth of the Golden Gate is very narrow. And by building Fort Point and a couple of other forts around this area, the Army really could secure the mouth of the Golden Gate.
So it was in 1853 that they began building this place. They began building Fort Point, and it was going to take them 8 years. And you think, well, why did it take so long to build this damn place? It was complicated. And if you go back in time, if you put yourself back there, you know, the technology was a lot different than it was today. The state of the industry, building. So many things went into building this place that aren't initially apparent. It was a hell of a complicated thing to put this building up. Behind me, that bluff is about 100 feet above my head. And the first thing that engineers had to do is they had to knock all of that down. I am at fort level. And that created an incredible amount of debris. And what were they going to do with that debris? Well, when you come here, you will notice the seawall. And all of the debris, they used that to kind of create a berm that they built the access road on top of. And if we put ourselves in 1853 California, when there wasn't a lot around here, and think about the lack of infrastructure, railroads and other ways to get materials here and there, they weren't really in place. So getting this built was incredibly difficult and expensive.
Essential construction materials like granite and bricks had to be sourced from locations near and far. The granite was shipped from China and came from the Sierra Nevada mountains, while most of the bricks were manufactured locally just up the hill from this spot.
I think Mark Twain said the coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco. Trust me, if you come to Fort Point, dress for it, because there's a good chance if it's summertime, it's going to be foggy and cold.
If you think about California, the gold rush in 1851, there was a shortage of labor. So many of the eligible workers were going up to the Sierra Nevada to try and have a go and find some gold.
So just to find and retain labor, it was no easy task in 1853 San Francisco. So the federal government had to pay really, really high wages to keep people on the job site here.
And then there's the simple fact of design and engineering. From the outside, the building doesn't look like much. But when you go inside and walk around this space, when you see how exacting the building is, the brickwork and the design, the gun emplacements and the quarters where the men lived. Engineers really employed some really cutting-edge design principles for that time. As you move about the fort, you're going to notice the multi-tiered casements, the openings that faced in all directions so that the cannons could be pushed through these openings and fire on any enemy.
And I gotta say, the National Park Service does a fabulous job with this place. There are exhibits exhibits in there that are really well done and interesting and appropriate for younger people who might not be interested in history, but the exhibits are really engaging, and I suggest you come. Also, make sure you check when it's open, because it's not open every day. Check the NPS website for the actual hours, because if you're going to make the effort to come here, you want to make sure it's open.
And finally, the coastal environment at the mouth of San Francisco Bay, it's a tough environment. Today it's foggy and a little bit windy. It's often like this. It's going to be cold. There's going to be a lot of weather happening. And on any building project, especially a difficult one like this weather creates problems. It delays things. It makes things take longer. And that was certainly the case here at Fort Point. Despite all of these hurdles, the builders, the engineers, the architects, they got this job done. It took 8 years, and it wasn't easy, and it wasn't cheap. If we kind of look at what was required at the time, that was $1.25 million to build Fort Point. If we adjust those numbers for inflation, we're looking at over $50 million to build the fort that you see in front of you. So they finished Fort Point and they put it into service just in time for the beginning of the Civil War, 1861. And it didn't see any action during the Civil War, but there were 350 men who were stationed there. There were over 120 cannons, and they were prepared to defend the bay against any enemies. Now, fortunately for San Franciscans, the fort never saw any active engagement, and no one tried to get past Fort Point. But something happened during that war that really turned everything upside down. There were forts on the East Coast that were built like Fort Point, and the powers that be in the military quickly realized that technology had passed these types of buildings by.
And I don't suppose that's really a big surprise, because technology will do that. Things that were useful and important become irrelevant and unimportant almost overnight when technology leaps forward. Now, there were two things that happened that really affected the usefulness of Fort Point. The first was kind of the development of the steamships. Steamships are much more maneuverable and could kind of tack and avoid the fields of fire that Fort Point was set up. And the second one was what they put on those steamships, and that was long-range rifled artillery. As opposed to cannonballs, which aren't very accurate and you can't fire all that far, all of a sudden they had rifled artillery. So they had much longer gun barrels, and they were rifled, so there were grooves in them. And these steamships could sit far offshore and lob shells into a fort like Fort Point, and it was pretty much defenseless.
So what were they going to do with Fort Point? Well, it turns out they didn't do much with it. Between the end of the Civil War and when they turned it over to the National Park System, it was used basically to store supplies. Mostly there was a skeleton crew who kept things up, maintained the fort, but it didn't see a lot of useful action.
And then came the building of that thing behind me, the Golden Gate Bridge. They were all set to demolish Fort Point. Well, the chief engineer of the Golden Gate Bridge, Joseph Strauss, he had something to say about that, and it surprised a lot of people.
He saw Fort Point as really a monumental achievement of military engineering. What they did at that time period impressed him, and he felt it was really an irreplaceable piece of San Francisco's heritage. It had been there so long and been so important, he believed it should be protected. And I think the nerd in him came out a little bit, because as he toured Fort Point and got to know it a little bit, the skill and the ingenuity of the past engineers really impressed him. He really made an effort and was successful in making sure that Fort Point was preserved while they were building the Golden Gate Bridge. And I think we all owe Joseph Strauss a debt of gratitude for going to bat for this little fort at the foot of the Golden Gate Bridge.